This is a train. And more often than not, this is how most people see them. It doesn't seem like much, the way it lumbers down its track carrying passengers or freight. To a select few, there's more to it than that. They see something more in these machines that casual observers don't pick up on. There's something magical and irresistible about seeing them, whether it's cold and standing still, or alive and moving. To them, they look, feel, sound, and smell like nothing else on Earth. It's a common belief among these people that trains are more than just machines. They are the closest mankind has come to recreating human life. For one weekend in May 2019, the center of all things railroading was on the eastern shore of the Great Salt Lake in Utah. The anniversary of a great milestone was celebrated here, as witnessed by up to 20,000 people who came far and wide for the celebration of a lifetime. But what's so significant about all of this? Of all the trains in the world, what made these ones so special? And why are they still here with us? To investigate why people are so fascinated by these things, we would have to explore the backstory of this industry as far back as it goes, over 150 years ago. The Industrial Revolution had produced many great feats of engineering, as the process for rolling and forging iron became an industry standard. There were two great breakthroughs in that time. One was iron wheels rolling on iron rails, which created very little friction for horses and mules to drag carts out of coal mines. Another was burning coal inside of a boiler to produce steam, to drive a beam made to pump water out of the mines. In 1804, British engineer Richard Trevithick married the two breakthroughs together. He harnessed steam in a boiler positioned horizontally and connected it to flow through cylinders to push pistons back and forth. These pistons were connected to side rods, which were connected to wheels, which guided the engine along a track with iron rails. Critics of the time claimed that the smooth wheels on smooth rails would just spin futilely, like rubbing one's finger on a piece of glass. What the critics hadn't considered was adhesion supplied by the engine's weight, so much so that the so-called locomotive could outpull the horse by carloads. From its genesis in England, it wouldn't be until 1827 when the first ever railway was incorporated in the United States. From its foundation in between the eastern seaboard and the Appalachian Mountains, the network of rails spread thousands of miles. Some of these lines would penetrate these formidable mountains, opening up the Midwest for settlers. By 1849, the country was threaded by just over 1,000 miles of iron rails, with few reaching as far west as the Mississippi River. And then, gold was discovered on the other side of the continent. Within a year of the subsequent gold rush, the far-flung territory of California gathered enough citizens to become a state, 2,000 miles from the rest of the country. In between the civilized world and the land of new opportunity lay millions of acres worth of open space. Getting to this part of the country, though, whether it was on foot, horseback, stagecoach, or covered wagon, was long and daunting. On average, it took months to battle against harsh weather, wild animals, and the dozens of Native American tribes. If not traveling over land, settlers could spend the same amount of time sailing all the way down the Atlantic coast to Cape Horn at the southern end of South America, and then sail northward up the Pacific. Taking a shortcut across the Isthmus of Panama would mean going up against disease-carrying insects in these swampy, humid jungles. If the country had any hope of staying together, only one mode of transportation could bridge the gap. In 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed off on the Pacific Railroad Act, authorizing the construction of a 1,868-mile-long ribbon of rails to the Pacific. From Omaha, Nebraska, came the Union Pacific, which blazed its trail across the Great Plains of Nebraska and the mountains of Wyoming and Utah. From Sacramento, California, came the Central Pacific, which blasted and chiseled its way through the Sierra Nevada mountains via Donner Pass and across the blistering deserts of Nevada. All told, construction took 7 years and drew in workers from any and all race and creed: American, Irish, Chinese, and Mormon. On May 10, 1869, the two railroads came head-to-head at Promontory Summit, a desolate location just north of the Great Salt Lake. Representing the two halves of the world were two 440 American-type locomotives. From the east came Union Pacific No. 119, a stalwart product of the Rogers Locomotive Works in Paterson, New Jersey. From the west came Central Pacific's Jupiter, an equally ornate graduate of the Schenectady Locomotive Works in New York State. In between these engines lay the Laurel tie, in which would be driven not one, but 6 special spikes made just for the occasion. It's said that the last remaining gold spike was tapped in with a silver maul, with telegraph wires connected to it to transmit the hammer blows for the rest of the world to listen to on their telegraph keys.
The spike will soon be driven. The signal will be 3 dots for the commencement of the blows.
All right, Governor.
Oh!
Perhaps we need a real railroad worker up here to make this star job done. There we go. Drive her home. That's it.
Folklore to the country. Bulletin. D. O. N. E. Done.
At long last, the United States of America were truly united. Over time, the so-called overland route would be joined by other transcontinental routes. The Union Pacific would procure routes extending northwest to Portland and south to Los Angeles. The Central Pacific would be leased to and later merged into the Southern Pacific, which became an integral nerve center in their system. The Denver and Rio Grande Western would reach Salt Lake City from Denver in 1883 by acquiring smaller railroads in the area and carving its own route over Soldier Summit. It wouldn't be until 1909 when the fever subsided, with the arrival of the Western Pacific, built in direct competition against the overland route between Salt Lake City and Oakland. But wherever these trains came from, you couldn't get anywhere without coming to Ogden, or so the city's Chamber of Commerce proclaimed in their motto. This area had already been settled as early as 1847, when a Mormon missionary named Brigham Young led a band of pioneers to this area and said, "This is the right place." As the junction for 4 separate railroads, more pioneers, Mormon or otherwise, had better access to the prospering land, where they could settle down and start a new life. By the turn of the century, Salt Lake City by itself had grown by 40,000 new residents. They came here to escape religious persecution and pray in the Mormon temple, to ignite their sense of adventure by skiing in the Wasatch Mountains, and to reconnect with the natural beauty of the world by going hiking up and around Bridal Veil Falls. As the proclaimed Crossroads of the West, this vast parcel of land in the northern half of the state seemed to be one of the most inviting places on Earth. The railroad boom didn't stop there, though, as it seemed like every town wanted to get themselves on the map. Some of these towns would be reached via so-called branch lines, which deviated from the main line to serve towns and villages off of the beaten path. One of these branches split from the Rio Grande main line at Provo and had to carve and chisel its way through the Wasatch Mountains to reach the town of Heber City. By the time the rails reached Heber City in 1899, railroading was becoming a standardized industry. Trains now depended on air brakes to keep movement under control. Signaling was conducted with semaphore arms, steel replaced iron as the standard material, and travel for passengers became much more plush, more accommodating, and less hair-raising. They had even revolutionized time itself, in an era when it was 12 o'clock by looking where the sun was at in the sky. No one living in that time seemed to care much because of how long it took to get from one place to another on foot, but by operating with such punctuality and precision, uniform time zones were established to keep up with traveling's quickening pace. Railroads like Union Pacific were now employing locomotives that were twice as powerful as their ancestors, as more freight customers shipping by rail meant longer and heavier trains. 280 Consolidation number 618 was born in 1907 in Eddystone, Pennsylvania, to lug freight over the Oregon Short Line. She was one of over 100 so-called Harriman Consolidations, so named after the robber baron who sat as chairman of the Union Pacific, Southern Pacific, Kansas City Southern, and Chicago and Alton, among other companies. Locomotives designed with the Harriman Common Standard had the benefit of parts being interchangeable across 4 different types of engines, reducing maintenance expenses and increasing reliability with tried and true designs. Because of this, 618 would keep delivering the goods for the Union Pacific for 51 years in revenue service. For all of the ruggedness of this tough business, the train also had quite the romantic following. Writer Henry David Thoreau likened the train's passing, as if the earth had got a race now worthy to inhabit it. Ever since its creation, people had developed a fascination with the train. Who was that riding on board? What freight were those cars carrying? Where was it all coming from? Where was it going? Many who stood by the tracks looked up to the people on board as role models. Engineers, firemen, conductors, brakemen, switchmen, and hostlers. Going by train was more than just transportation. It was also an adventure that could take anyone from the humdrum of their homeland and into the wild and unknown, anywhere in the country and even to places beyond its borders. For many, this was truly the golden age of railroading. That was, until a new way of getting around came around the corner. The horseless carriage had undergone its own revolution, offering convenience and increasing reliability like never before. As more people started taking to the road more often, the revenue from carrying those passengers and freight went with them. For the first time in its life, the train was getting left behind. But if the railroads were going to stay relevant in an ever-changing world, innovation was the only way to stay ahead of the curve. In the depths of the Great Depression, Union Pacific unveiled its first ever streamlined train, the M10,000. The affectionately named Little Zip was powered not with steam, but with an internal combustion engine that generated electricity to power the wheels. With its lightweight duralumin construction, speeds of 100 miles per hour or more were hit on a regular basis. The streamlined craze was followed by a fleet of armor yellow speedsters, reaching out from Chicago to the Pacific Ocean, taking half as much time to get there as the old steamers. Just about all of them passed through Ogden and branched out to Portland, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. Ridership surged back as rail travel suddenly became more attractive, luxurious, and sometimes even fashionable. War followed the Depression, which meant more freight was needed to keep the troops in both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters well supplied. The Union Pacific predicted that trains would swell up to 3,600 tons, which would need up to 3 locomotives to keep them rolling through the mountains. To get that much freight moved with one engine, it was time to go big or go home. The railroad's Department of Motive Power utilized everything they knew about steam technology to create what could only be described as a monster. With 16 drive wheels split into 2 groups of 8, and a boiler producing 300 pounds of superheated steam, their creation stretched 132 feet from coupler to coupler, tipped the scales at over 1 million pounds, and could pull up to 4,000 tons of freight by the drawbar, with as much as 6,345 horsepower. All put together, UP's creation would be one of the largest locomotives in the world. The engine men would refer to them simply as 4,000s, while the official name was deemed to be Wasatch or Sherman, after the hills it would be destined to climb. Instead, the name came from a simple scrawling in chalk on the smokebox door. Big Boy arrived at Union Pacific's hometown in Omaha on August 5, 1941. In the course of the war, 25 big boys were put to work on the Iron Trail. They seemed to just walk away with any consist of cars they put on the coupler. They dragged freight that could stretch for a mile or more on a daily basis, and reportedly were capable of dragging a consist 5.5 miles long on level track, although this claim was never verified. Nevertheless, few locomotives on Earth could beat Big Boy's power, which seemed to captivate the world's imagination by his sheer size and power, in war and in peace. After the war, the world was a very different place. Modernization trends that were diverted to helping America's victory would promptly be put back on the agenda to keep pace in a world where potential customers could move by road or by air. If the railroad industry was to keep pace in this new world order, that meant letting go of things. The old route over Promontory Summit was long, steep, windy, and treacherous. The line would be bypassed in 1904 by the Lucin Cutoff, a 12-mile-long causeway across the Great Salt Lake. The rails would stay intact until 1942, when they were ceremoniously torn up to contribute to the war effort. The old Jupiter and 119 had been scrapped 40 years earlier. In the post-war boom, steam lumbered on the forefront of railroads' innovation, but on limited warranty. The diesel-electric locomotive may have been cleaner, faster, more efficient, and cheaper to operate, but most of them couldn't top the big boys' power. Even so, the big boys continued to roam well into the 50s, eventually reduced to their old stomping grounds in Wyoming as late as 1958. In time, glamorously named passenger trains would be discontinued, freight patterns were reorganized to meet changing demands, and some railroads took their business to the roads themselves in a bid to keep the stakes in their empires. The hardest hit were the branch lines, which didn't stand a chance against the cars and trucks that whizzed by the trains as if they were standing still. The line to Heber City would continue service at a leisurely pace until 1967. Other branch lines that had outlived their usefulness had their rails torn up completely. 150 years later, it seems like the spirit of railroading itself was dearly departed, and yet, it wasn't. As early as 1948, residents around Promontory Summit began holding reenactments for the wedding of the rails. The annual gatherings built up in scale over time, which led directly to the establishment of a National Historic Site at this spot in 1957. The rails, ties, spikes, switchstands, and the layout of the track is set just as it was on that glorious day. As for the locomotives, the Park Service commissioned Chad O'Connor Engineering to build full-size, operating replicas of the Jupiter and 119, the first new full-size steam engines built in the U.S. since the 1950s. During the summer months, they sit with pilots touching, face-to-face on a single track, half a world behind each back. The steam era never truly left the main line either, as the Union Pacific has donated dozens upon dozens of older steamers to communities to stand as monuments of the past. Only one was kept on the active roster. 484 Northern Type number 844 was the last steam engine to be purchased new by the railroad, and is the only one in the whole country to have never been retired from revenue service. Now based in Cheyenne, Wyoming, her current job is to roam the UP's vast 32,000-mile system, to summon nostalgic spirits that still haunt these rails, and to introduce new generations of people to what railroading truly means. She is joined by two stablemates, the Challenger 3985 and the Big Boy 4014. Of the 8 surviving Big Boys, 4014 was reacquired from a museum in Pomona, California, and rebuilt to working order at the shops in Cheyenne. He is the first and only one of his siblings to have felt movement under his own power in over 60 years. His journey to Ogden was his introduction to the modern world, marking the beginning of a new career as the largest operating locomotive in the world. Others took preservation into their own hands, setting up non-profit groups to save historic rolling stock, buildings, and track. The branch line to Heber City would be reincarnated in 1970 as a tourist train, affectionately known as the Heber Creeper. Harriman Consolidation number 618 would be acquired from the Utah State Fairgrounds and brought back to life, carrying guests into the Provo Canyon for well over 30 years. Although currently undergoing a thorough restoration, the tradition continues with vintage diesel locomotives guiding visitors into yesteryear, with some help from a few friends and foes. Their work in providing a place for heritage has been formally recognized as one of the region's biggest economic drivers. But rail's revival isn't just limited to its heritage. In 2008, Utah Transit Authority kicked off Frontrunner, introducing daily passenger service between Salt Lake City and Ogden for the first time since 1997. As the space between the two cities gets more and more crowded, with the streets and highways becoming more congested, Frontrunner offers the option to bypass traffic completely for a stress-free ride from home to the store, the doctor's appointment, Lagoon Park, and back home again. As for the railroad that is building America, it's business as usual. Today's modern freight trains are operating with ever-increasing efficiency and innovative new technologies. Just 1 ton of freight can be moved by rail for over 423 miles on just 1 gallon of fuel. Diesel-electric locomotives are running with twice the horsepower as half a century ago, yet emitting far fewer CO2 emissions and achieving greater fuel efficiency. They continue the never-ending conveyance of freight, some of it being moved with intermodal containers stacked on one another, which can be offloaded onto trucks for local destinations, or onto freighters for sailing to the other side of the world. It may not look the way it once did, but the railroad has never truly died. With each great leap forward in operation or maintenance, the drawbacks of the previous leap forward could fall by the wayside to create a more efficient mode of transportation. The trains we have today, whether they were built decades ago or just yesterday, are still making a big difference for the world. As long as there are people who are passionate about trains, they will always be with us. Whatever happens in the next 150 years, the railroad can be made to fit with whatever the future comes up with next.